Autumn sun slipped through the lace curtains and broke into warm mosaics across the long oak table Macy had spent her morning perfecting. 24 linen napkins folded like white lilies. 24 vintage plates she'd hunted down at yard sales and estate auctions, each one a little history lesson in blue glaze and hairline crackle. 24 crystal stems catching rays of gold until the room itself felt aflame with welcome. She'd polished the silver that once belonged to her grandmother, pressed the creases into place cards with a bone folder, and hummed under her breath as she set a final sprig of rosemary on the platter of roasted chicken. It wasn't extravagance. It was proof of care, of work of worth. This was the house Macy had fought for, 100-year-old craftsman with stubborn bones and good light, the first dream she'd ever allowed herself to hold without apology. Today was the housewarming. Today was her day. Her phone chimed once, then again, then in a relentless cascade that turned the air sharp. She ignored it at first. People always texted last-minute questions, but the insistent staccato began to sound like an alarm no one else could hear. When she finally picked it up, the screen bloomed with social media alerts. And there they were, her entire Black family, grinning into lenses and raising glasses, inside an apartment living room she recognized from the background of her brother's earlier posts. Brandon, handsome as ever, flashed perfect teeth and the old, unearned swagger. Her mother, Linda, stood arm in arm with him, pearls against a satin blouse. Her father, Charles, tall and reserved, half smiled under the weight of responsibility. Aunt Susan held a champagne flute up to the light. Uncle Robert threw an arm around their cousin Melissa. Even her grandmother, thin as paper and luminous as memory, perched in the corner with a tender smile. The caption read, "So proud of our boy's first home purchase. The Taylor family is celebrating Brandon's big milestone." For a moment, Macy couldn't feel her hands. The room tilted, not a dramatic lurch, but a slow, humiliating drift, as if gravity had chosen someone else. She swiped to the next photo. More relatives, more laughter, more toasts. A video autoplayed with Brandon's voice over the fizz of poured champagne. "Macy's always showing off with her fancy renovation posts," he joked, winking. "Today is my day." The phone slipped from Macy's fingers and clattered onto the table. She pressed a palm to her mouth to contain the sound that wanted to escape, but sorrow disobeyed. Tears blurred the edge of the roast, the gleam of glass, the fine calibration of all that care. She had woken before dawn, nerves too bright to sleep. She'd reviewed her handwritten checklist beneath the quiet thrum of the refrigerator and the slowly lightening sky. She'd thought about the 7 years of hustle that made this day possible, 60-hour weeks between her data engineering job and weekend freelance contracts. The studio apartment with furniture left over from college. The 3 times she'd lost bids by a whisper before the craftsman no one wanted landed in her lap, like a dare she meant to accept. When she signed the papers, she'd stood alone in the empty living room and pressed her palm to the worn archway, promising the house she would not leave it half-loved. The first sign that the story might turn came at 1:45 p.m. when Linda texted, "Running a bit late start without us." By 3:30, Macy's co-workers, Jane and Peter, had arrived with a vase of dahlias and an expensive bottle of red. Her elderly neighbor, Mrs. Eleanor, 83 and sharp as a tack, shuffled in with a homemade pie. 3 friends from college showed up with wine and the warm kind of hug that says, "I see you." But none of the chairs with family names were filled. At 4:15 p.m., Macy called her parents 7 times. The calls ran to voicemail like water. Brandon didn't answer at all. Finally, at 5:08 p.m., Aunt Susan picked up her voice, nearly swallowed by the party swell behind her. "Honey, aren't you coming to Brandon's housewarming?" Macy stared at the table she'd set at the name, cards that felt like little letters returned unopened. "Brandon rents," she managed. "He didn't buy." A pause. "Well," Aunt Susan said carefully, "that's not what he told everyone. Anyway, he scheduled this last week, said it was important to him. Macy found her voice. I sent invitations a month ago. Today, 2:00. Silence pooled between them. Oh dear, Aunt Susan said, finally. Well, we're all here now. Maybe you could stop by later, after your little gathering. After your little gathering. The words bruised on contact. Macy hung up. The house felt suddenly too large for her body, the ceiling too high for her breath. Her gaze landed on the name card that read Brandon in the elegant script she had practiced, and heat rose into her face. Anger ache, a lifetime of being the older daughter who was told independence was her crown, and a closed mouth her duty. A chair creaked. Mrs. Eleanor rose spine long and gaze steady. She lifted her glass and waited until the others, which was to say the people who had bothered to come, lifted theirs. Don't let empty chairs steal your joy, dear, she said in a voice that had seen many rooms and many kinds of betrayal. Today is Macy's day. The 7 who were present raised their glasses high. Rachel Brown's skin, catching the window gold hair tied back with the casual confidence of someone who knows what matters, leaned in. This is your real family, she whispered the ones who choose to be here. The phone buzzed again. Mom calling. 7 pairs of eyes watched Macy from around a table weighted with care. Macy set the phone down, silenced the ring with a thumb that surprised her by not trembling, and lifted her glass. Not today, she said. Today is about the people who showed up. Her voice felt like a path she could step onto and never step off. By the time the last guest left, the sky had folded itself into evening. Only Rachel remained, sliding leftovers into containers that would feed Macy for days. Stay at my place tonight, Rachel urged. We'll drink wine and watch terrible movies. Macy shook her head. I need to be here. This is my home. The word home hovered in the air, fragile as glass and somehow unbreakable. When the doorbell rang, Rachel and Macy looked at each other not with dread, but with the clarity that follows a decided heart. Macy opened the door to find Linda on the porch, pearls gleaming like small, perfect boundaries of their own. She didn't wait for an invitation. It's nice, Linda said, walking past, eyes sweeping crown molding and refinished floors. Smaller than it looked in pictures. Why are you here? Macy asked. Linda set her purse on the sofa and turned with the practiced poise of a woman who expects to be obeyed. Honestly, I don't understand why you're making such a big deal about today. Your brother is finally doing something positive, and you couldn't even show up to support him. A sound, almost laughter and almost a gasp, slipped from Rachel. Macy's body remembered every time she had swallowed hurt because the room demanded it. Not tonight. I didn't show up, Macy said quietly, because I was here hosting the housewarming I invited you to 4 weeks ago. These things happen, Linda replied, dismissing with a flick what Macy had built with her hands. Brandon only decided last week. He was so excited. Something ancient and untreated in Macy came into alignment. She thought of honor roll ceremonies missed for average football games of a scholarship, overshadowed by her brother's disappointment of rent, quietly paid for his years of between opportunities of her own gains, called indulgence, while his losses earned sympathy and cash. She thought of love that was always measured in what she could carry, and never in what could be set down. Did you know he scheduled his party on my day? Macy asked. Linda looked at the pillow she was rearranging and said nothing. You knew, Macy whispered. You all knew. The realization sliced clean. Get out. Linda's eyes widened. Macy Elizabeth Taylor. You do not speak to your mother that way. Macy opened the door and held it with a steadiness that electrified her arm. I just did. When the door clicked shut, the house did not echo emptiness. It hummed with the after ring of truth spoken aloud. Morning found Macy at the kitchen sink, fingers around a mug, aware of a kind of quiet that was not loneliness. When the doorbell rang again, Charles stood on the porch alone, a potted plant in his hands and uncertainty in the slope of his shoulders. He did not barge. "May I come in?" he asked, voice softer than she remembered. Inside, he took in the details the cupboard stripped and re-oiled the bookshelves she'd sanded by hand the office, with the second-hand desk she'd revived with lemon oil. In the backyard, he paused beside the raised beds. "You did all this yourself?" "Most of it," she said. "Friends helped with bigger projects." He nodded slowly. "It's beautiful, Macy." The compliment looked awkward on him. It was perhaps first language learned late. Then came the old script fumbling for a foothold. "Your mother is very upset. Perhaps if you apologize," Macy cut in gentle and firm. "I won't apologize for telling the truth." He mentioned their estate. She told him she didn't need their money. For a moment, something behind his eyes cracked open anger at losing leverage or grief at a daughter he had not learned to see until now. He set the plant carefully on the counter, as if acknowledging that planting sometimes matters more than what you think you own. When he left, Macy opened her camera roll and found the photo Rachel had taken 3 months ago. Macy, a black woman with paint flecks on her cheeks and pride like sunlight in her smile, standing on the porch with keys in her hand. She posted it with a caption that named only the work and the people who had shown up. No tags, no subtweets. Just truth. That afternoon, in the sandalwood-scented calm of Dr. Elaine Foster's office, Macy learned words that held the shape of her family: golden child, scapegoat, enmeshment triangulation. Labels didn't change the past, but they allowed Macy to see the pattern and step outside it. "What would your life look like?" Dr. Foster asked, brown eyes kind and uncompromising, "if you stopped seeking their approval?" Macy stared at her hands. "I'd be alone," she said. "Are you sure?" Dr. Foster tilted her head. "Count the chairs that were filled." Macy thought of the 7 who raised their glasses of Rachel's palm at her shoulder, of Mrs. Eleanor's crisp voice cutting the quiet like a bell. She exhaled. Maybe not. The first weeks after the housewarming felt like walking barefoot after years in tight shoes. Every step was both tender and startlingly free. Macy learned to let her phone buzz without answering. She stopped reading family group chats that told a story in which she was always the problem, the too sensitive elder sister who couldn't take a joke, the overachiever who flaunted what she had instead of helping. She curated a smaller life on purpose and watched it grow larger where it mattered. Sundays bloomed into ritual. Rachel arrived with a bottle of mid-priced wine, and a playlist that stretched from Anita Baker to H.E.R. Jane brought her famous kale salad and an opinion about every novel she read. Peter slung his guitar into a chair and played in the corner something gentle that made the house breathe easier. Mrs. Eleanor shuffled in with cuttings from her garden and instructions delivered like heirlooms. "Tomatoes need a firm hand," she said, demonstrating how to pinch suckers from the vine. "Same as boundaries. If you don't do it early, they'll take over the whole plant." Macy laughed and took notes. At work, she began to notice who was standing where. Alexis, a junior data engineer with quick intelligence and the posture of someone bracing for impact, lingered after meetings as if asking permission to exist. One afternoon, Macy found her in the kitchen, staring into the fridge as if it might reveal answers. "You good?" Macy asked, not casually, but with the open space of real listening. Alexis's eyes filled immediately. "My mom says my job is selfish," she blurted. "She wanted me to be a nurse. I tried, but I love this, and she says I don't love her." Macy recognized the language of conditional acceptance. She poured coffee, slid a mug across the counter, and shared in a few careful sentences the shape of her own story. She didn't offer a fix. She offered a chair. In the weeks that followed, Alexis began to stand taller. Your advice changed everything, she texted after telling her mother she couldn't attend a last-minute multi-day reunion. First boundary ever. Brandon resurfaced on a Wednesday evening with a text that sounded breezy and too deliberate. "Hey sis, can we talk?" When Macy answered the door, his smile was all practiced charm, teeth bright in the porch light. "Place looks good," he said, stepping inside without waiting. He traced a finger along the edge of the mantel as if appraising. Mom and Dad might have overreacted, he offered, which was as close to an apology as he seemed able to get. Then he pivoted so fast, the air didn't have time to catch up. "I've got this investment opportunity real estate development downtown. Small buy-in, big upside. Thought of you since you're into property now." Macy folded the dish towel over the oven handle. How much, she asked, not because she was tempted, but because she was curious about the shape of the ask. "Just 15,000 to start," Brandon said, tossing the figure like something light. "I'll pay you back once it takes off." The old map unfurled Brandon as initiative, Macy as infrastructure. Explained away risk, outsourced accountability. Macy looked at him, really looked, and realized she had spent her life translating his irresponsibility into potential. She remembered the football trophies no one dusted, and the business plans their parents financed and then gently buried. She could feel even now the old reflex to rescue twitching in her muscles, like a habit that thinks its time has come again. She exhaled and let the reflex go quiet. "No, Brandon," she said, and felt the floor hold. "I'm not investing." His expression stumbled. "You don't even want details, I already have them," she said. "I've lived them." He laughed, not kindly. "You've always thought you were better." Macy didn't flinch. "No, I've always known I had to be enough for myself." He left with a shrug that pretended he didn't care. A week later, Jennifer called. Macy had never met her, but she knew the outline, pretty kind, new to the family's orbit. "This may be inappropriate," Jennifer said, voice steadying as she spoke, "but I'd like to meet. Your family talks about you when you're not there. I want to understand what I'm marrying into." The candor surprised Macy into respect. They chose a coffee shop by the river, and Jennifer arrived in a simple dress and honesty. She explained her divorced parents, a father, much like Brandon, who had perfected the art of the story, and a mother who had bent around him until she broke. When Jennifer asked how to navigate Macy's family, Macy thought of the terrace she had not yet stood upon. "Choose the truth," she said, "even when people call it disloyalty." She paused, especially then. The engagement announcement followed as if it had always been scheduled to arrive precisely when Macy's calm could most be tested. Brandon's grin filled her phone. She said yes, engaged. A ring brilliant enough to cast light on debts no one was naming. Linda called within minutes, voice too bright to announce the engagement party at the Westbrook Country Club. "This is important, Macy," she said the word. Important doing work, her tone could not. Family obligations come first. Texts poured in from aunts, uncles, cousins, a choir of obligations singing a song Macy knew by heart. "Aunt Susan, your mother says you might help with wedding expenses since Brandon is between opportunities again." Rachel read the message over Macy's shoulder and made a sound that was almost a laugh and almost a growl. "Of course," she said. "The golden child needs another bailout." Macy crafted careful responses. "Congratulations," she texted Brandon, full stop. To the family, she wrote, "Thank you for letting me know. I'll consider my schedule when the invitation arrives." The words tasted like clear water. Dr. Foster called it selective engagement. "You don't have to attend every fire you're invited to," she said during their session, eyes warm. "Some blazes only burn if you bring wood." Macy nodded. "I'll go," she said after a long silence. "But for me, not for performance." Before the party, Charles appeared on Macy's porch with a cardboard box and an expression that didn't know which direction to lean. "Found these in the attic," he said, placing the box on the coffee table. Inside, photographs Macy had never seen lay stacked in soft envelopes. Macy at 5 with a science fair ribbon. Macy at 12 in her grandfather's workshop sanding a board with unself-conscious joy. Macy at 16, face lit by the thrill of keys to the used car she bought with her own savings. Macy, in a graduation cap, smile broad and uncontained. "I took these," Charles said quietly. "Your mother thought it was silly to waste film on everyday moments." Under the pictures sat a small envelope with a lilac seedling list tucked inside. "Your grandmother loved lilacs." Charles added gestures tentative, as if he were learning to speak a dialect of love he'd not been taught. He cleared his throat. "We failed you," he said finally. "I failed you." The words landed without fireworks. They were a kind of weather change, measurable and modest. Brandon told everyone the engagement ring is paid for. He went on, eyes on his hands. "It's not. He didn't ask for money. He didn't ask for anything." He lifted his gaze. "Your mother wants me to convince you to attend, to bring a generous gift." He took a breath. "She doesn't understand that things have changed." Macy watched him, felt something uncoil, something else hold fast. "Some things have," she said. "Some haven't." When Linda arrived 2 hours later without knocking, the house's air pressure changed. She launched into command. "You will attend," she declared, "and you will behave, or you won't be family." The words that once cut now sounded like an empty can kicked down a familiar street. "That's not a choice you get to make anymore," Macy said, voice even. "I'll decide on my own terms." Linda's face reddened. She tried another angle grievance, the old gravity. Macy showed her to the door and closed it gently. On the day of the engagement party, Rachel stood with Macy at the entrance to Westbrook's cream-walled reception hall, fingers squeezing Macy's hand once hard. Macy wore a forest green dress that skimmed, not shouted. Her hair was natural, her earrings small. The room paused. Relatives rearranged their faces. Aunt Susan's whisper fell like a dropped spoon. Brandon's smile faltered for a beat before recovering its gloss. Jennifer's gaze found Macy's and softened in recognition. Linda and Charles approached in tandem. Linda's relief at Macy's presence tightened into calculation. "How thoughtful," she said for the crowd. Macy smiled a neutral smile that had taken months to learn. 20 minutes of small talk, stretched like taffy. Macy stood at the refreshment table, sipping sparkling water, when Linda leaned in, voice sugar-coated for nearby ears. "Listen carefully," she said, not looking at Macy's face. "Don't mention your house tonight. This is Brandon's moment." The old choreography tried to recruit Macy's feet. Macy set her glass down. Before she had to choose words, Jennifer appeared. "There you are," she said warmly to Macy, then to Linda with a polite nod. "I've been hoping to catch you." "We were discussing family matters," Linda said, smile fixed. "I'm here to celebrate you," Macy told Jennifer, letting each word drop like a pebble into clear water. "Nothing else matters tonight." Linda's fingers whitened around her glass. The script had lost a page. Jennifer touched Macy's elbow, grateful. Brandon's toast arrived as predictably as the house lights dimming. He spoke about milestones, about gratitude, about a future so bright he needed sunglasses. "As you know," he said, lifting his flute as if it had been heavy this year, "has been full of achievements. My new home purchase? This engagement." Macy didn't flinch. She sipped her water. Around the room, a murmur moved confusion at the claim, a shuffle of eyes toward Jennifer, who stood very still. Aunt Susan studied her plate as if it contained an answer. Linda adjusted a centerpiece with too much care. Charles watched the floor as if it might instruct him. On the terrace later, spring air cool and unperfumed, Jennifer found Macy. I had no idea, she said, voice quiet and unbreaking. The apartment, the job promotion, the savings that don't exist. She inhaled. Your parents know. They've always known, Macy answered. How do you handle it? Jennifer asked. Macy looked at the sky. You learn to stop handling it. The door banged open. Brandon strode out, face flushed, the charm cracked. What are you doing? He demanded, turning her against me. She asked me questions, Macy said. I answered honestly. You've always been jealous, he spat. Jennifer's shoulders squared. I asked your cousin Mark about the apartment, she said. He looked confused. So what if I rent? Brandon snapped. Everyone embellishes sometimes. Macy felt a tiredness so deep it was almost peace. It's not the rent, she said, not for him, but for herself. It's the story. The terrace had filled with 2 other relatives and a silence that registered new information. Linda appeared in the doorway, voice tight. Macy, don't make a scene. Charles's words came like a small door opening in a closed house. Let her go, Linda, he said. We've done enough. Macy walked past them all, past the gift table and the floral arrangements and the ring that glittered like a promise it couldn't keep. Outside, Rachel waited by the car. Ready? She asked. Macy looked back at the windows glowing gold with a party she no longer needed to manage. Yes, she said and meant it. They drove home with the windows cracked to let the night in, and for the first time, Macy felt what it was to leave a room without leaving herself behind. A year is enough time for a garden to teach you what love and discipline can do together. The beds behind Macy's Craftsman softened from raw soil into living texture. Tomatoes muscled up their cages. Basil crowded itself fragrant. Rose canes climbed thorny and insistent into shape. On Sunday afternoons, when the sun had tipped toward gentle friends, filled the house until conversation threaded through rooms like music you could lean against. The same table that had once made empty chairs loud now wore 8 place settings, and the blue vases Macy loved, each one holding dahlias or zinnias, or whatever Mrs. Eleanor insisted could be coaxed into bloom if you respected its temperament. Gardens don't rush, Mrs. Eleanor had said, that winter eyes bright above the scarf she insisted wasn't necessary. And they don't apologize. When her health declined, she still came by with advice and a recipe card for pot roast in the precise hand taught in a schoolroom where penmanship was a subject. The day Macy found out that Mrs. Eleanor had passed, she went outside and watered the soil in long, careful arcs, whispering thank you to the dirt, and the memory of a woman who had taught her that tomatoes and boundaries were cousins. Charles kept showing up clumsily at first, and then with a rhythm that felt like the beginning of a song. He would bring small offerings, a bag of mulch, a level, a lilac bush in a plastic pot. He stood at the edges of rooms and learned to wait for invitations instead of assuming entry. He learned to say, "It's beautiful," without adding, "but." He learned to ask, "May I?" and sometimes to hear, "Not today." He learned slowly to separate love from leverage. Linda stayed in absence, sending formal texts about neighborhood events, as if nothing had shifted, as if the engagement party had gone off without truth spilling everywhere like a knocked-over drink. Brandon spun forward, announcing a new job that evaporated, a new hustle that failed. The engagement dissolved quietly. Jennifer called Macy and said, "I'm choosing peace," and Macy said, "I'm proud of you," and neither of them named the relief they could both taste. At work, Macy's influence extended beyond code commits and sprint boards. She started a brown bag for junior engineers called Build What You Love, which was really an excuse to talk about the architecture of a life. They traded stories about first apartments and first boundaries, about parents who misunderstood technology and managers who were learning to understand people. Alexis led a session on negotiating salary and looked afterward like someone who had relocated her backbone to right under her skin. "You changed the trajectory of my year," she told Macy in the hallway, trembling with a good adrenaline. "No," Macy said, smiling. You changed it. I reminded you. In therapy, Macy and Dr. Foster tapered sessions from weekly to monthly. How's your nervous system? Dr. Foster would ask, and Macy would inventory without judgment. Sleep more regular, phone, quieter shoulders, less tight, laughter, easier to summon. I've learned to build fences, Macy said once, half joking. Not just the white picket kind. Dr. Foster laughed, the kind that put warmth into a room. Fences let you decide where the gate goes, she said. And who has a key? One crisp Saturday, Rachel and Macy hosted a paint day for the guest bathroom. The room filled with music and off-key singing and the smell of fresh latex and pizza. Peter told a ridiculous story. Jane ranked her top 5 books with the ferocity of a sports commentator. Samantha's daughter darted like a small comet down the hall. They took a break outside, and Rachel leaned back against the porch rail, eyes closed to the sun. This feels like a life, she said aloud, as if trying the words out for size. Macy looked at her at the way Rachel's presence had become native to the house's air. It does, she said. Rachel opened her eyes and held Macy's gaze for a beat that said the word that hadn't been said yet, us. Days later, Macy's phone vibrated with a message that made her face do the scrunch Rachel could read at a glance. Brandon's social post gleamed with performative joy. She said yes, he wrote of a new girlfriend 5 weeks into a courtship. Finally found the one. The ring in the photo could have paid off 2 months of someone's credit card. Underneath, a chorus of relatives sang the old hymn of praise. Linda called on cue, voice pitched high with importance. We're planning an engagement party in 3 weeks, she said, every syllable a test. This is significant, Macy. Family comes first. Congratulations. Macy said nothing more. After the call, Aunt Susan texted with a financial suggestion couched in obligation. Rachel read the message and snorted. The audacity, she said, and Macy laughed, the sound surprising her with its ease. Macy agreed to meet Jennifer for coffee. Not the new fiancé, but the woman who had dodged a future by listening to truth. Jennifer arrived with a haircut she'd given herself, a tangible symbol of change, and a contentment that didn't ask to be believed. I feel like I've been exhaling for weeks, she said, a little embarrassed by her own relief. I wanted to thank you. Macy shook her head. You thanked yourself. They talked for an hour about the way a life can tilt when you remove the weight of someone else's myth. When they parted, Jennifer squeezed Macy's hand. If they try again, she said, meaning both of them, and also the whole pattern, call me, and I'll remind you of this table, this coffee, this breath. On a Wednesday, Macy found Charles on her porch, holding a cardboard box, like an offering to a god he hoped would be kind. Another attic find, he said, setting it inside. She lifted the lid. More photographs, more ordinary miracles. Macy asleep on the couch, with a book splayed on her chest. Macy in middle school, fixing a wobbly chair with a screwdriver. Macy at a barbecue, laughing, head thrown back, while Brandon made a face that slid between adoration and envy. I took these, Charles said again, as if repeating the sentence might make up for the years he didn't say other ones. He looked at her then, out the window at the garden that was learning to know itself. You built something beautiful, he said. The words held steady. Macy nodded. I did. She let the quiet hold them both. Then came the text from Aunt Susan, family dinner this Sunday. Important to reconnect. Macy felt the old pull, the duty, the second-guessing, the fantasy, that this time the table would be different. She took the thought to therapy, not because she needed permission, but because she trusted the mirror Dr. Foster held up. What would you go for? Dr. Foster asked. Honesty, Macy said after a long breath. To see if anything's possible. What would you leave if you needed to? The moment I'm called selfish for telling the truth, she said. The moment I'm asked to fund someone else's plan with my piece. Dr. Foster's smile reached her eyes. Then you know your time limit. Sunday dinner happened at her parents' house, the kind of suburban perfection that photographs well and breathes badly. The silence when Macy walked in was thick with rehearsed lines. Brandon cracked a joke that nobody caught. Charles cleared his throat like a metronome. Linda served without eye contact. They made it through salad and small talk before Linda set her fork down with a click that announced transition. I don't understand why you had to buy such an expensive house, she said. All that money when you could have chosen something more reasonable like Brandon did. Macy stood not with anger, but with clarity. I didn't come here for another performance, she said. Charles rose too, instinct twitching toward old roles. Family should forgive, he offered, trying to staple everything back to the script. Family should be worth forgiving. Macy answered and walked out. She didn't slam the door. She let it close with the quiet that follows a decision you're not negotiating anymore. Back home, the house received her like a friend who knows when to talk and when to let you sit. Rachel showed up with ice cream and no questions. Later, they went out back and dead-headed roses under a sky that felt like mercy. Will going back hurt you? Rachel asked. Macy thought of the table, the fork, the click. It's a scratch, she said. Not a wound. She leaned into Rachel's shoulder and let the silence say the rest. Weeks turned into months. The garden deepened, the house became fluent in laughter. Macy mentored Alexis through a promotion. She learned to fix a leaky faucet without cursing. She called Charles sometimes first. She ignored Linda often on purpose. She didn't ask social media to witness any of it. When she did post, it was a photo of her hands soil dirty, holding a handful of cherry tomatoes like jewels. The caption read, "Things grow where they're wanted." On the anniversary of the day, she had set a table for 24 and served dinner to 7. Macy stood in her kitchen, arranging dahlias in the blue ceramic vase that had become a kind of family crest. 8 place settings waited not because she couldn't seat more, but because 8 was right. The house smelled like Eleanor's pot roast, the recipe exact and forgiving. The walls, freshly painted, wore photos of Macy's chosen family, Rachel on the porch railing, Peter holding a guitar like a promise, Jane laughing with her whole face, Alexis mid-speech with hands mid-air, Samantha's daughter catching fireflies in the twilight while everyone clapped and pretended to be surprised every time. Rachel stepped through the doorway with a bottle of wine held like good news. You've been up since dawn, she teased. It's a ritual, Macy said. Eleanor swore smell alone could heal the worst days. Rachel set the bottle down and slid an arm around Macy's waist. The house exhaled content to be in the room with the two of them. You know this is home for me, Rachel said, the sentence a soft truth rather than a request. Macy turned, rested her forehead against Rachel's, and let a future unspool without needing to name its every thread. For me too, she said, and the quiet after felt like a vow. The doorbell rang. Charles stood on the porch holding a lilac bush in a burlap sack and uncertainty tucked under his arm. He looked at the photos on the walls and the table set not for impressing, but welcoming. Thought your garden might have room, he said. Macy smiled at the plant. I know the corner, she said. He walked through the room slowly, not judging, not appraising, just seeing. He lingered at the bookshelf, touching the spine of a novel his mother had loved, a novel he had never seen in Macy's hands before, because he had not been paying attention. She would have been proud, he said, suddenly surprising himself. Of you! She always said you had hands that knew what to do. Macy held his gaze. I'm glad you remember, she said. He nodded, the gesture small and necessary. Guests arrived in 2s and 1s until the house sounded like friendship. Charles stayed not as National Geographic exhibit dad among friends, but as a man finding his way back to a room he'd never truly entered. He fetched ice. He told a funny story badly and owned it. He asked Peter about guitar strings and listened to the answer. At dinner, Jane raised her glass. To the house that truth built, she said, echoing Eleanor's toast from her last good day. They drank to that, and Macy watched light slide across the faces she loved, across skin and laughter lines, across the sturdy furniture of lives that had chosen each other. Later, as twilight caught in the hydrangeas, Charles joined Macy on the porch. Streetlights blinked awake like stars who'd taken a different job. "You built something beautiful," he said. He had learned not to follow it with a question. Macy nodded. "In this house and in my life." He wanted to say he was sorry for the years he had not seen the difference between loyalty and silence. He wanted to say many things. He settled on, "I'm proud of you," and discovered it was not a consolation prize, but a true thing he could give without losing his place. Inside, Rachel started a game at the table, and everyone groaned theatrically and laughed as if they'd never laughed before. The sound floated out into the evening like good smoke. Macy's phone buzzed on the counter with messages she didn't feel compelled to open. Family obligations came dressed in urgency. Something she was building taught her that urgency was not the same as importance. The lilac bush waited by the back door. "We'll plant it tomorrow," she told Charles over by the fence. He looked toward the garden, where a white gate Rachel had painted last month stood open in invitation and closed in safety. "A good spot," he said, and Macy heard what he meant, a boundary that kept in and kept out, and didn't apologize for either. After dessert, the house shifted into that echoey afterglow when good company leaves the air charged like a chord still vibrating. Rachel and Macy stacked plates in a companionable choreography. "Do you ever miss them?" Rachel asked, not unkindly, meaning the reverberating absence of a mother and a brother who had chosen their myths over her. Macy considered. "I miss what I used to hope they could be," she said. "But the hope was eating me." Rachel nodded. "You fed the right hunger." They stood in the kitchen a moment longer, two black women who had built something rooted and warm in a world that often made them prove that warmth wasn't a weakness. The doorbell rang again, late enough to register as unusual. On the porch stood Linda Posture, cloud-high eyes scanning the living room as if it had to pass inspection to be real. She stepped forward without asking habit as muscle and stopped when Macy didn't step back. They stood there door wide as decision. "May I come in?" Linda asked, finally, words unfamiliar on her tongue. Macy measured the moment with her whole body. She nodded once. Inside, Linda took in the photos, the easy evidence of a life she had not believed in because it didn't orbit the sun she could never stop rescuing. "It's nice," she said, then caught herself. "It's beautiful." The word cost her something. Macy knew because she had paid similar costs for other words. "Thank you," Macy said. They stood by the table that had held both absence and abundance, and Linda placed her fingers on the edge like a penitent prayer. "Your father brought me the photos," she said, not looking up. "I didn't know he kept them." It sounded like she was saying she didn't know he'd seen Macy clearly. "I'm not here to argue," Linda added. I want to try to be better." Macy didn't rush to fill the silence. She thought of Dr. Foster's question about gates. She thought of the garden and the fence and the lilac bush waiting. "Trying looks like respecting my—" "No," Macy said, finally. "Trying looks like celebrating me out loud without telling me in the next breath that it's too much. Trying looks like loving Brandon without making me responsible for saving him." Linda nodded, an awkward motion, as if the hinge had grown rusty. "I can try," she said. "I can't promise perfect." "I'm not asking for perfect," Macy replied. "I'm asking for honest." They did not hug. They did not cry. They set a date, coffee next week, a public place, an hour. When Linda left, Macy stood at the door and listened to her own breath. Rachel appeared at her shoulder. "How do you feel?" Macy considered the whole constellation of sensation: skepticism, tenderness, grief for what wouldn't be recovered, cautious relief that a gate could open without the fence falling down. "Like I've learned the choreography of myself," she said. Rachel smiled. "I like the dance." After the last dish was washed and the last glass turned upside down to dry, Macy went out back with a spade. The night air smelled like leaves giving up their summer without regret. She dug a hole by the fence wide enough for the lilac to stretch. Charles took the root ball from the burlap sack and lowered it into earth with the reverence of someone newly fond of beginnings. They tamped soil watered deep and stood side by side in the quiet. "She had one by our first house," Charles said, voice thick with memory that had finally learned how to look forward. "Your grandmother." "I know," Macy said. "I think she'd like this spot." They leaned on their shovels and let the dark hold them. Inside, Macy sat at the dining table, the wood warm under her palms. She ran her fingers across the grain and thought of the girl who had once believed love meant setting a table for people who might not come. She thought of the woman she had become, who learned to set a table for the ones who did, and to let that be not a consolation, but a ceremony. She opened her notebook, the one where she kept both grocery lists and realizations, and wrote, "True family is who chooses to see you and who you choose to see." She added, almost without thinking, "Build what you love, and love what you build enough to protect it." Later in bed, Rachel's breathing even beside her. Macy scrolled past the old photos and stopped at the one from last year, her on the porch, keys bright in her palm. She smiled, not with triumph, but with the contentment of a builder who knows the foundation is sound. She closed her eyes and let the house wrap its quiet around her, like a blanket it had knit while she wasn't looking. If you've ever set a table and watched the empty chairs flood your chest with questions, if you've ever mistaken disapproval for a mirror, if you've ever been told that independence is the same as not needing anyone, hear this from a woman who learned to read the weather of greed and the geometry of grace. You are not required to shrink to fit a room that was built for someone else's myth. You are allowed to build a house out of yes and no, and to fill it with people who arrive on time with both hands open. The lesson isn't that family fails. It's that family must be chosen again and again, blood or not, by who shows up and who stays, by who tells the truth and who can bear to hear it. Macy learned it the long way, with paint under her nails and rosemary under her knife, and a porch light left on for the ones who knew how to knock. She will keep learning it, planting lilacs against a fence she built herself in soil that remembers and forgives. Like the story, if it resonated, tap. Like to support these tales, share it with someone who might need courage tonight. Subscribe for more powerful, true-to-life dramas, and tell us in the comments, what's the boundary you're ready to build and